Today, Professor Andrew Przybylski from the University of Oxford and the Oxford Institute is joining us. Professor Przybylski is one of the most careful and rigorous scientists who happens to study how social media and video games influence the health and well-being of their users. He's published more than 100 peer-reviewed academic papers that have been cited more than 30,000 times and regularly contributes to the New York Times, BBC, CNN, and many other outlets. I'm also fortunate enough to call Andy my friend.
Hey Matt, thanks for calling, and I'm really happy to chat.
Thank you. I'm hoping you can help make sense of the relationship between well-being and technology use. In the past few years, some popular press authors and politicians have made extraordinary claims that social media is causing a mental health crisis in teens, and that social media may be worse for teens than smoking cigarettes. As one of the world's leading experts on the topic, what do you think when you hear these claims?
My first thought and feeling about it is actually curiosity. My initial reaction when people panic about a new technology, because I've seen now panics about like video games, panics about the internet in general, panics about AI, panics about social media. For me, it's always about trying to figure out, is there a there when it comes to the benefit or harm to mental health and well-being, and how does it interact with human motivation? And how scientific is that process? Where is science in the agenda setting for, say, holding large tech companies accountable for our mental health, or the individually or in terms of our society? But yeah, so the last few years have been a bit of a wild ride, because essentially there was a local maximum with Tahrir Square and the Arab Spring, where platforms could do no wrong. And then there was a gentle slide right through Cambridge Analytica and Edward Snowden and these other types of things, where we became much more, as a set point, less utopian and much more dystopian. I think that with Frances Haugen taking the Facebook files and the way that was viewed a couple years back in 2021, we're up to this point in the other way where people are almost as overly exuberant about technology on the negative end as they were before on the positive end. For me, I just try to figure out, well, what are the opportunities for good science here? What are the opportunities? What's the space for good science and policy? And then whether it's hype or fear mongering, like what are the ways that you could actually set an agenda that would be good for parents or good for society, instead of, say, just bad for tech executives or just good for them? Because I really don't think that that's the way that we would make any progress as a society.
Right. These panics are incredibly predictable throughout human history. Plenty of research shows people tend to prefer the status quo, and change makes them anxious. New technologies embody change and therefore trigger this anxiety. Your colleague at Oxford, Amy Orban, wrote an excellent paper on this, which I'll link to in the show notes, called The Sisyphean Cycle of Technology Panics, in which she describes how many societal elites loudly insisted that the printing press, radio, calculator, television, and more would bring about mental health crises and the downfall of societies. And yet, here we are. There are some loud voices making similar claims about social media today.
There's a lot of loud voices today, whether they're in the Valley or in the EU or here in the UK. As a parent also, honestly, I think these people hate tech companies more than they like kids. And that terrifies me, because 10 years ago, I was worried that people liked these tech companies more than they liked kids. These kinds of debates that we have, I'm just concerned that it winds up being much more about score settling or opportunities to make money than it does actually protecting the most vulnerable people who use these platforms.
Hold on. Could you elaborate on what's been going on to cause the pendulum to swing in the last 10 years?
Yeah, I think that there's two things that kind of are going on at the same time. The first is that there's an assumption of tech company omnipotence in psychology. But there's this idea of ego depletion, which is this idea that, like, in your mind, there is a gas tank of willpower, and you can kind of spend through that gas tank. And if you still have to make hard calls by the time you tap out, then you're much more likely to do all kinds of impulsive behavior, and you can refill it by drinking a milkshake. Literally, like you can refill the gas tank with sugar.
Hold on. Now, I've been out of the academic bubble a little bit the last few years, but my understanding is that this whole a cookie a day, a milkshake a day keeps the anxiety away, or the self-control at bay. I thought that stuff didn't replicate.
Oh no, it doesn't. It doesn't at all. And that's my point.
Okay.
That's my point, because
just a metaphor.
It's a metaphor, right? And there is a real reality underneath the fact that when you're tired, you make bad decisions. When you're burnt out, it's just not possible to think, right? And so we have a very unsexy idea like tiredness, And then it gets dressed up in this big metaphor, like ego depletion. And psychologists really believe this for like 15 years. There's this guy called Roy Baumeister. He's this kind of right-wing social psychologist. And he tends to think of psychology as like this kind of metaphorical process. And so I take your point exactly that absolutely there's a boring tiredness explanation for something like, the Arab Spring, which is that people could just talk to each other in a way they didn't before. It doesn't mean that Google unleashed some blah, blah, blah. It doesn't mean that Facebook let people tap into their souls and experience George W. Bush levels of freedom in their hearts. But by the same token, when there's this type of myth making, as opposed to solid data in some way, it's easy to assign omnipotence to tech companies. Like, the thing they do is they turn data on us into money. They're kind of good at it, and they're certainly good at it at the scale that they operate. But you have to have that one ingredient. You have to have like a story, a metaphor of omnipotence.
Okay, to recap, you're saying the first thing that is going on is that people saw the incredible power that these companies have when people use their products to overthrow governments, and that they are essentially alchemists capable of turning the dog pictures we upload into ungodly amounts of money.
That's one part of this. Then the second part is, in this tech backlash, you have these events where, the scandal of Cambridge Analytica is not that it changed anyone's votes, but the idea that people's data was processed in a way that we might find distasteful, unethical, or illegal is 100% a consistent concern. Like, the idea that governments monitor us and violate our human rights is not a new idea. But Edward Snowden showed that it was happening on a scale and at a frequency that is a real good source of caution and concern for us, right? And so I think that what happened was tech companies were viewed both as omnipotent and also at the same time either incompetent or evil with handling our data. There's the dumb part of that, which is they're manipulating us through very basic social psychology, or they're violating some aspect of our personal or our private selves by the way that they handle or process our data. And I think that these two things brought us from 2010 through 2017, when some of these conservative psychologists came back. There's this longtime collaborator of Roy Baumeister, a woman called Twenge. She's well known in some circles as a researcher of narcissism in teenagers, like what's wrong with the kids today. And in 2017, she wrote a book that claimed very confidently, before she had done any peer-reviewed research on the topic, that the thing that was wrong with kids today was that smartphones had destroyed their generation. And so some time passed, like fairly extreme claims, some academic papers, and it links into the worst things that we suspect about tech companies, which is that they're omnipotent and they're out to get us.
So, in other words, these extreme claims and fear-mongering rhetoric, regardless of their scientific merit, help give people a thing that they tend to seek during stressful times throughout history. A scapegoat. Something to blame bad things on, so we don't have to take accountability.
She gave people a thing that they're out to get. They're out to get our kids and their mental health. Not that they process our kids' data illegally, or that our children deserve privacy in both their personal lives and in terms of their data lives, but kind of a much broader claim. In the same way that Tahrir Square was only possible because of tech companies' power, a mental health epidemic is only possible because of tech companies' power. And then more recently, Twenge, she teamed up with another American psychologist, a man called Jonathan Haidt. He's pretty well known.
A man I happen to know quite well.
Okay, well, there you go.
PhD advisor.
Okay, there you go. Well, I don't need to tell you, but I could ask you what his background is in large-scale quantitative mental health data analysis. But I would not, if you had put a gun to my head, I would not have said that Jonathan Haidt's primary strength is in replicable, large-scale open data science. I would say that he is well known for a series of findings from about 15 or 20 years ago around moral personality characteristics. But he did become an expert on international epidemiological data with the publication of a book this year, back in March, I think. And yeah, it sold 31,000 copies, which is apparently enough to get you on the New York Times bestseller list. Who knew? And that's kind of where we're at right now, where we have these kind of a handful of researchers, American academics mostly, who are kind of on the opposite side of that swing. They're researchers who are just very sure that either teenagers or society have been destroyed by Instagram or Mark Zuckerberg or the Chinese or Steve Jobs. It's really fun being in mid 2024. It's been a hell of a wild ride since the mid 2017.
Part of the argument that John and Gene make is that somewhere around 2010 or 2012, the number of people using smartphones increased, and mental health problems also increased, implying a relationship between smartphone use and mental health. Yet, in every stats and research methods course that I took and later taught, the mantra, correlation does not imply causation, was drilled into my brain, and hopefully into the brains of my students. Isn't that what we're really looking at here? Without good experimental data, can we really know anything about the causal effects of smartphones or social media on mental health? Or on any outcome variable for that matter?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, in the nicest way possible, I too teach inferential statistics and research methods. And I would say that either the books by Jonathan Haidt or Gene Twenge would not receive passing marks in master's level or PhD level reports. I don't know. They would have to reset the class because it's not even correlation. It's drawing lines on a graph. It's spurious correlations. It's like these things have a natural tendency, not natural, but these have kind of a periodicity to them in terms of, say, the fluctuations of how mental health is reported in the population. And it is absolutely true that if you restrict a time range from this point to this point, 2000 and X through the current day, or 2020, right? And you ignore the Y-axis, and you ignore any data before the year 2006, it does look, if you put it on percentages instead of putting it on absolute values, it does look that things have gone up, but if you put it on its real axis, it looks flat. And then if you extend the time series back 20 years, it looks like the world's most gentle U-shape. And it's one of these things where there's like lots of ways that you can measure mental health and well-being in a population. And it's the case that if you squint really hard and then you cherry pick specific statistics, you can make the case that there are mental health problems, especially in the American population, that might look really bad, especially in the last 10 or 15 years, especially for middle-aged men in Appalachia. But if you squint past that, you can see that there's kind of also something going on with young people, which is quite negative. But I would refer you back to what you said before you talked about mental health or well-being. Something must be going on there. Because you were saying something like, the iPhone came out at a certain time, and kids started using social media at a certain time. And unless you're very specific about that, you actually aren't talking scientifically. And I'll just be, so depending on what part of one of these airport books you open and read, the problem either starts in 2010, or it starts in 2011, or it starts in 2014, or it starts in 2015. I just listened to a podcast where the researcher David Blanchflower, he's an economist, he confidently stated that the year of change was 2016. So either the problem started in 2010 or 2016 or somewhere in between. And the issue with this is that let's imagine that there is an association. Let's imagine that there is a dose-response relationship, right? You'd expect it could scale at all, right? So in order for teens to have at the beginning of a mental health epidemic in 2010, that means that something bad must have been happening to them in 2009. And that bad thing that happened to them is 13% of them had an iPhone. None of them had Instagram, because Instagram didn't exist, right? None of them had Facebook accounts. Well, maybe some of them had Facebook accounts because Facebook was just open to high schools at the time. They certainly had MySpace. But let's imagine that like 13% of them, the year later, it had a 5% increase in mental health problems. Then the next year, it was up to 27%, but it only goes up 1% higher. And then
just to be clear, 27% had adopted an iPhone in that.
Yeah. So you'd expect if it was an amount of a drug that you were putting in the water table, you would anticipate that if you kept the dose the same and more of the population had a chance to get infected or like drugged, you would imagine that there'd be some type of sharp curve of increased damage, right? But instead, what you have is young people go from really not at all saturated to but above 100% saturated with smartphones and social media from between like 2003 through now, right? And you would expect that if there's any type of dose-response relationship, we wouldn't have numbers going up like 5% or 10% across a decade. we would actually have numbers going up 100%, 200%, 300%, unless teens are just like really good at adapting to every new algorithm that comes out of TikTok and Instagram. And we really don't need to worry anyway, because things are going to flatten out when they get to 100%. And I guess, like, to your correlation equals causation point, you have to think about that really carefully, because the United States isn't the only country in the world that has the internet or social media. 90% of people under the age of 18 actually live in countries that are not in Europe and not in North America. And they all use the internet too. And so if you wanted to actually ask a question about how does social media impact people, or technology or the internet impact people, you actually have to look at data from South Korea and Japan get certain technologies before Germany. And Germany gets certain technologies before the United States. And Ecuador after the United States. So you'd actually have to build a statistical model that says something about, not cause and effect, but about the nature of this association across time, across, say, the last 5, 10, 15, 25 years. And that's just not something that many people have the time or attention to try.
One area that this is sometimes compared to is big tobacco companies messaging around how cigarettes were safe and they had health benefits and these were good for us. There were some strident people that were challenging
psychologists,
the status quo narrative for a long time. Some psychologists even were saying, no, cigarettes are actually bad for you, and they must be lying about their benefits. How can we know if John Haidt and Jean Twenge aren't just strident heroes trying to save people from the big tobacco product of today?
They wouldn't be so easily convinced by terrible evidence. I don't know. I mean, Matt, honestly, the metaphor here, the comparison to tobacco is a really good one, because there were a series of class action, very profitable class action lawsuits against tobacco firms in the 90s. And while all the states squandered that money and didn't spend it on healthcare, as they said that they would, they used it to fill budget gaps.
And they also gave me a bunch of really bright colored shirts, and they flew me to Orlando.
Wait, this is Dare or this is Jonathan Haidt? Who's this?
Oh no, this was Truth.
Truth. I don't know this. Okay.
So Truth was one of the nonprofits that was.
Okay.
It was spun up after one of the class action lawsuits in Florida against big tobacco. They gave us a lot of money, and they had students like me going places and talking about how these companies are manipulating youth and trying to get them hooked on products before they're legal, and then have customers for life.
But you know why? Do you know why they were able to afford to fly you to that highly educational, highly effective program, give you that fancy T-shirt? Because the science was there. There was basic data, there was basic chemistry, there was basic biology, and you could show that there was damage on the genetic level, the cellular level, the organ level, the individual level, and the societal level, right? Airtight, okay? The big tech companies are going to win these lawsuits. If their most competent opponent, is the data that Jonathan Haidt and Jean Twenge give them when they're paid as expert witnesses, then the state's attorney generals are going to lose, because it really only takes a handful of competent statisticians to point out all of the mistakes in all of the evidence that they bring forward. And that was not the case in the big tobacco lawsuits. I should say now, I take no money from any of these people on one side or another. And I've told the people who want to make this work on each side that I think you're going to have to do a lot better, because you don't just get one shot. But if you think of it as one shot, the way that this is being argued right now, it's a serious topic and it's not being treated seriously.
So just for the record, to be 100% crystal clear, can you say that you've never taken any money from big technology companies?
100%. Yes, I can. And my current Freedom of Information request from the Wall Street Journal will show that again, as that I believe that's the 4th or 5th time I've received an information request on this. No, I'm currently funded by 3 things. It's on my website and on the website of the Institute. A grant from the Huo Family Foundation. It's a family foundation that's mostly about the arts, but is increasingly investing in teen mental health. Something called UK Research and Innovation. It's kind of like NIH in the US, but it invests not just in medical research, but also in social research in the ESRC. And I'm a consultant for something called the Sync Digital Wellbeing Program, which is a cultural and mental health initiative run out of Saudi Arabia. And I do advise them on research strategy because they run these large global studies in parts of the world that people who look like you and me don't care about. And they measure the harms and possible benefits, but more harms of technology, upwards of 30 countries up until last year. And they're going to launch a global study in the coming year, 50 countries, predominantly in the global south, in places where Western funders frankly don't care. And also tech companies demonstrate a lower level of caring, pretty pronounced one. So those would be my 3 considerations of interest, not necessarily conflicts.
Okay, so you haven't taken any money from Meta or any of these other tech companies. What's the problem?
The problem here is that this is such a complicated topic, Matt, and it's such an important topic. And it is the case that if you're like me and you say, oh my God, this is complicated, there's not a quick and easy solution to this, it's very easy for people to understand that as being some form of obstructionist or some form of doubter that is getting in the way of the need to rebalance the scales around technology in the public interest. And so I get why there's that skepticism, but I think that the best way to interpret that is by calling for more transparency, not just from researchers ourselves, but also in terms of transparency from companies. Like Instagram rolled out today or yesterday, or will roll out at some point before January, this idea of, in some ways, protecting the privacy rights of younger users and also giving them some level of control and some level of reminders about things like how late to go, this and that, right? And I think that sounds fine. Who the hell knows if it's going to work? I mean, probably not. But the thing that needs to happen is an external body needs to independently verify or test. Do these changes make a positive? Do these affect the user experience in the way that Meta appears to claim that it will? And so I think that, you or I might have interests as researchers. Some of them might be political, some of them might be financial, but these companies also have interests that need scrutiny and need a detailed accounting for.
You mentioned greater transparency being one of the keys here. I happen to agree, and I've been working with people in the EU government over the past year. They flew me out to Brussels, and I led this workshop.
Oh, see, you're in the pocket of big transparency now, Matt.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah,
I'm also
in the pocket of regulators.
Big transparency. Yeah.
Unfortunately, they haven't actually compensated me for anything. They just
but
tell
it's
me to
influence.
show up
It's
and
influence.
then talk about stuff.
It's influence. Yeah.
Yeah, it's something. And I love doing it, but because I think that in order for us to have a serious conversation about what the real effects of technology are, we need to know what the data are. And one of my big problems with a lot of the research that I see that talks about, oh, there's a loneliness epidemic, or, oh, social media is causing teen girls to commit suicide, is that it's like the measurement is terrible, absolutely terrible. Most of those studies, they measure social media use not in actual using of the platform, but rather self-reported use. So how many hours and how many minutes do you open your phone and then scroll through your different social media apps? As a social psychologist, I've published way too many papers using self-report data. So I do believe that survey data and asking people for their thoughts on things matters, and it's a useful technique. But we also know from the long history of research on attitudes and attitudes measurement is that we know that there's a gap between the measurement and the actual latent attitude.
Right. And we know
there's also a gap between the attitude and the behavior. So when you're asking people something like, do you like tech companies? People can say yes or no. Like, that is not a hard attitude to assess. But if you're asking them something more difficult that requires more reflection, like, so how many minutes did you use TikTok yesterday? People can't answer that. And
Matt, it's so much worse
repeatedly,
than this.
There are dozens of papers.
So much worse.
There are dozens.
Yeah, but there's dozens of papers.
There are dozens of.
But the problem is,
there are dozens of papers out there on this very point, showing maybe hundreds. I don't know. I've definitely read dozens. Okay. I haven't read.
I'm teasing. Go on.
I don't doubt it. So every paper I've seen on this shows that there's near zero correlation between people's self-reported time use on these platforms and their actual use. And we even did some studies on this internally, and we could find no meaningful relationship. Now, that seems rather problematic if we're saying social media use causes these harms when the social media use is not their actual use, but reported use.
So I've read. You're right. There's dozens of papers on this, and they've been combined in different ways. And no, Moira Burke's papers on this. There's internal Facebook studies of this that have made it out, and you can count on a self-report of somebody's use of a platform correlates in a way. So there's about 16% overlap between what they do and what they say they do. So upwards of 80, 85, 84% of when someone fills out a questionnaire and says, this is how much I've used Facebook, played a video game, TikTok, used my mobile phone, about 85% of that answer has nothing to do with their objective use. And it's not just people underestimate or overestimate, they're all over the place. But people who are more depressed, they overestimate. So it's a real problem if you're studying something like depression and social media use. If your way of measuring social media use is confounded more with depression than it is with the true behavior of using social media. And so when I said the thing about hundreds, I thought you were talking about the articles out there. Of those, there's hundreds or thousands. But of those that have looked at this association, it ranges from 0 to 16%, depending on how you ask the question. And Facebook's best answer to that, according to, again, what came out of Kai, that's one of these social web conferences, is if you ask it in just the right way, at just the right time, it's like 18%. Or 20%, or something like that. That's what I mean when I say that if these lawsuits are going to be based on such low quality evidence, stated so overconfidently, they're not going to win, because it's just too easy to knock down many of the core over-claimed hits, and that will create doubt, where there should be uncertainty around a lot of this stuff, Matt. But the overhyping is going to create doubt. And that's the thing that's going to get them. Because you can't create new science. You should not create new science via law. But man, you should use law to back up good science. So the question you have to ask yourself is, if we're not very good at measuring mental health, and we're extremely bad at measuring tech engagement, what should we make of researchers who always find a negative or claim a strong negative correlation between tech use and mental health? Should we believe when they don't show their data and they don't show their code and they don't have their hypotheses before they have access to their data? Should we believe that they have the one magic formula that nails big tech companies to the wall? Should we believe that when researchers pre-register their result, pre-register their analysis plan, when they show all of their code and they share all their data, should we assume that those researchers are somehow secretly in the pocket of big tech? Or do we need to get real about the fact that these companies cannot keep holding our data hostage? That these companies cannot deprive us of access to user data. Sorry, psychologist slipped there. Because that is what we need to determine what is it about platforms that are actually positive or negative for us. And that's the resource that is the one that when you realize that your telescope is broken, when you realize that self-report isn't going to cut it, you have to go to the actually good thing. You just can't keep using that hammer. You have to go look. You have to look for a screwdriver. You have to build a screwdriver, or you need to have legislative action force the companies to build the screwdriver.
I will disclose that I've been advising some of the state attorneys general and some of the other law firms that have been bringing cases against some of these social media companies, and almost all of them ask me what I think about John Haidt and the claims that he makes. This is an interesting question, given that he was of my academic advisors. And I give them my understanding of the statistics and the science of it. And then their response is almost invariably, oh, good. That matches what all of the epidemiologists that we've talked to have said too.
The real scientists. Yes. Okay. Sorry.
Hey, there might be social psychologists that listen to what we're saying.
Yes, I think technically my PhD has the word social in it somewhere. Go on. Yeah.
Yeah, social psychologists are scientists too. At least there are investigators doing the due diligence to understand what the actual underlying data say is the relationship between mental health and social media use. Yet, there's a chasm between what they seem to have learned from scientists like you and I, and what the political appointees above them and some people in the media are saying. How would you explain this persistent chasm?
Sorry to put it so bluntly. I think some people hate big tech companies more than they love kids. I think that there are real reasons to be skeptical of big tech companies. I think that there's real reasons to be envious of the position and power they have in our society. I personally think that that should be very carefully looked at through political processes. I think that this idea that there's a negative effect on mental health or well-being that's a population-wide thing, I think for some people it's more of a means to an end. I don't think that they really care about the end, because if they cared about the end, they would listen to the epidemiologists, they would listen to you and I. I have no doubt that there aren't many tragedies that young people suffer as a either full or partial consequence of how they engage in the online world. It doesn't have to be this massive mind control Cambridge Analytica thing. Like 5,000 Americans die every year from distracted driving because they're looking at their phones and they're on social media. More children in the developed world are sexually exploited via online platforms than have cancer. And the rate at which we resource law enforcement and organizations like NITMEC in the US or Interpol here, and We Protect and these other organizations in Europe and globally, these organizations aren't at all funded or supported at a level to keep kids safe. Like Ron Wyden, senator, he proposed last year, his internet safety bill is literally to hire 5,000 more FBI agents to follow up on NITMEC reporting. So platforms tend to over-report child abuse material because the consequence for not reporting it is astronomical fines, but they can't triage quickly enough. They have old infrastructure. And after they triage, they don't know who to send these reports to. These are children's lives being destroyed, partially or via the pipes of these platforms. And we just had in Oxford here a global convening, including tech companies, so conflicts of interest there, but law enforcement and some researchers and research funders and people who run journals to set an agenda for actually studying this morass in a coherent way on all levels. And so I don't doubt at all that these platforms aren't part of the suffering of young people, but it is exceptionally unlikely that this is caused in the way from a concept like screen time or an idea like social comparison or something that fits into the American culture war in terms of parents' rights versus the rights of a teenage girl to her mind and her body. And I think that if you look at the way the different states' attorney general are approaching this and the way the different politicians are approaching this idea of making kids safe online, you'll see that there are fairly clear and flawed lines of reasoning that fall along partisan lines. And I don't limit this to, obviously not to people on the right, because I live in England, which is basically a communist hellhole compared to the United States. But like in blue states in the US, there's this idea that design codes are going to save everyone. And they're not. Before the pandemic, there were like, I'm not even kidding, there were like 90 AI ethics design codes out in the wild. Professor Brett Milstott wrote a paper on in Nature. And he looked back like a couple years ago and it was up to like 850. And the same thing is happening with design codes for kids. No one knows what the hell is going on. And they're just going to make these design codes, and then researchers at TikTok or Snap or wherever, they're just going to tick the boxes that they did the thing, and it'll be exactly as ineffective as Dr. Haidt's idea of digital abstinence. Abstinence only doesn't work with sex ed. It's not going to work with the internet.
I grew up in Florida,
God bless.
And I went to public school until high school. I certainly received abstinence-only education. I remember these horribly graphic images of what different STI or STD infections look like. And I'm in school and they're showing me pictures of pustules coming off of genitals in middle school.
That sounds like a good e-safety. That was like really good e-safety curriculum.
Yeah, well, again, it mirrors the anti-tobacco campaigns that groups like Truth and others were running. In my trip to Europe this summer, I saw some of those famous warning labels on tobacco products where it shows these very graphic images of a throat that had cancer or other horrible things that come from using tobacco products.
Oh my God. Are you going to put the picture of dead kids on every time you load up TikTok? Or are you just going to put a bunch of pictures of dead kids on a splash screen? What's the idea, Matt?
Yeah, I mean, the Surgeon General says that we need to have warning labels. Now, Do you think warning labels are going to have any positive effect or useful effect? Or is this just a theatrical trick to make it seem like we're doing something to try to solve a problem without actually solving the problem?
I'm not sure. My intuition is that there are a subset of people who don't really think about this at all. And it's possible that an authority figure will help them think more carefully about something that they let their kids use. And I think insofar as it starts a process of critical thinking, it could be a good thing. But I'm very skeptical because in the case of STIs, there's a biological reality there. And even if it's moralized, something makes that picture. There's a virus, there's an infection, there's something's going on. And in the case of the tobacco labeling, there is cellular damage, there is emphysema, there's a foundation for it, right?
Right, which isn't the case when you're chatting with friends or looking at pictures, even if those images display problematic content, which they sometimes do.
What's really happening is it's social information that's passing between young people. It will be very arbitrary what will be on the labels. The labels can't have reality inside of them because what's being talked about is like a social construct. So you're going to have to make some pretty big claims that will be fairly unevidenced to have any content to put on the labels, right? And my concern is that it will water down the idea of a safety label. And that's not to say that these things don't need to be safe. I've spoken with the Surgeon General about this, and there's a really clear point of agreement, which is that if you look at something like a child safety seat, it has these warnings on it, similar warnings on it about how to use this and that. And I think you only get to that point with something like physical safety outside of like cancer or alcohol or whatever. When you have engineers involved who can say no to their bosses, if you're an aerospace engineer or a civil engineer, automotive engineer, an engineer who makes child safety buckles, if your boss says, put less cement in this bridge, put less aluminum in this wing element, a titanium in this wing element, put less plastic in this seat at a certain angle. One of my sisters, she's an architect. If her boss says, let's save material, let's cut corners, let's move fast and break things, they can say no, and because they risk their license, they can say no to their boss without fear of losing their job. Well, maybe aerospace is a bad example, given Boeing's recent kerfuffle.
Yeah, I was just
whatever. I'm not an aerospace engineer. I wish, but I'm the least scientific person in my family. But they're all real scientists. Oh God, they're real scientists. But it's one of these things, though, where it's like, well, isn't it weird that our kids are in these environments that are organized by software engineers and different types of programmers who are building these environments, and there's no way for these people to say no to their bosses? Isn't it a strange thing that we have all of these e-safety officers and heads of global this and global that, and there is no curriculum for them? There's no license for them? I think that that's where the metaphor obviously breaks down with tobacco versus a pop-up, because, oh my God, when you were in Europe, what was your experience of using the internet in Europe? Did you get a very helpful guide to your data rights, Matt?
Oh my goodness. So I thought I was in hell in the United States, where every time I pull up any website, I have to click accept cookies on a bottom sheet that pops up, and then there's ad. Oh my goodness, what happened to the internet?
I know. It's pretty shitty, huh? I ask myself, is adding a warning from the Surgeon General going to be read and acted on in any way cognitively by a stressed out parent who's just trying to make a decision? Or will tech companies figure out a way to package that warning like everything else is packaged, and it will be wholly ineffective? My concern is it will be the obvious thing in that sense, and that will cost us an opportunity for more meaningful action. That's the thing. When people like Dr. Haidt or Dr. Twenge, when they go on TV, they're not advancing the interests of holding tech companies accountable for the common good for young people. Their behavior would be more serious if that was the case. They might feel like they're helping, but my God, do they suck up a lot of air. We ran this thing last week here at Oxford about global online sexual exploitation. It's about setting these research priorities for funders and for tech companies and whomever, researchers and practitioners. But I submit to you, we had 40 people come on the day, and we had another 40 on an online one for people who couldn't get visas to come to the UK. I submit to you that any of the people who came to Oxford to work on child sexual exploitation, any one of them would be a better dinner guest for Priscilla and Mark. And that's the problem. They suck oxygen out of the room. I think that Mama Fatima, the UN envoy and special rapporteur for sexual abuse against children, I think she should have sat with Mark and Priscilla. I don't think a business school professor from NYU has anything useful to say that's worth Mark's time.
Yeah. If abstinence only is not the way to solve the harm that technology has for some percentage of people that use technology, what is? How can we help make people safer? That's part one of my chat with Dr. Przybylski. In part two, he tells us what the biggest harms on social media are and what the best strategies for reducing them are. Thanks for watching part one. Let us know what questions you have in the comments and I'll do my best to answer them. Thanks again.